production of Pioneer Utility Resources. StoryConnect, helping communicators discover ideas to shape their stories and connect with their customers.
What can you do to improve your writing by making it even more concise? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of StoryConnect podcast. My name is Andy Johns, your host with Pioneer, and I'm joined on this episode by Teddy Feinberg, who is the managing editor at the Idaho Press, and notably our writing instructor at the StoryConnect conference coming up in Hood River, April 8th to 10th. Teddy, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast and for being our writing instructor at the conference.
I appreciate both opportunities immensely. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So Teddy will be joining us. Like I said, if you've not seen the thing sent out, we would love for our StoryConnect listeners to join us at StoryConnect 2024 in Hood River. More information on that is available at storyconnect.com. But we've got a great photo instructor who we'll have on a later episode. And then we've got Teddy, who was our writing instructor extraordinaire, who will be talking a lot of the topics that we've been kicking around for Teddy to get into with the workshop, deal with self-editing and with concise writing, kind of tight storytelling, being very efficient and effective with word usage. So before we get too far down the road, Teddy, just let's talk about the concept of self-editing, because that may not be a concept that folks are that familiar with. What do you mean when you say that folks can improve with some self-editing?
I'll even give an example right now, Andy. I'm
Sure.
working on a story on a weekend story that's pretty labor intensive right now.
Okay.
I anticipate that I am going to be self-editing my work, and I'm actually just working on a portion of the story. I am not working on the entire story. I am teaming up with another reporter to write a portion of it. And I anticipate my portion of that story, I am going to take an hour's worth of my time to self-edit it. And not only am I going to self-edit this portion of work, I'm actually going to step away from my laptop and I'm going to do it on my cellular phone, on a Google Doc, to make sure it's on kind of a different platform or a different device. So I see it a little bit differently from my perspective. And I will spend an hour doing that, because when I hand this piece of work in, I want to be as clean as a whistle. And I want my editor saying, this guy did it right. Thanks for coming. Appreciate your work. That's what I want. Okay.
And that's good. That's an interesting tip. I know a lot of folks will print it off and get after it with the red pen. The same kind of idea. You're doing it on digitally, but switching out of that screen. It's funny how the brain works. How it's easier to see stuff like that sometimes.
I think it's a little unconventional, but that might be my middle name. But at the end of the day, I think that I think it's valuable to find different ways to see your work and see also how readers are going to read your work. Part of the reason I actually read it on my phone is because, I think a lot of people are consuming their news that way.
Yeah, definitely.
And yeah, I think having it in different mediums, different platforms, I think is valuable. But most importantly, just taking time, self-editing is part of the reporting process, right? So just making sure you're taking some time and investing some time in that. Yeah, you write the story, but your job's not done when you write the story. Your job's actually done when you hand the story in, and you want to make sure that's a good representation of the work you put in.
Excellent. Now, we've talked about it before. I've got a newspaper background, went to journalism school, all that. And it's funny, I didn't realize until then, when you've got an experienced editor going through, and the kind of the crutches that we have, that is the word. It winds up for me, the word that will show up, and the editors would always go through, you don't need that so many times. It's perfectly fine without that word. It's just 4 extra letters taking up space. What are some of the things when you are self-editing your work? So that's the thing when I read my own copy that I always go through, particularly looking at that. But what are some of the things that, as you're self-editing, have you got like a kind of a mental checklist that you go through, and yourself as a writer well enough to know those things, or what are you looking for when you're going through a self-edit?
I think that's a great question. I really want to make sure that my story flows good and it sounds right. I personally have a habit as a writer of being too wordy. So again, when we talk about being concise, oftentimes when I self-edit my work, if I spend a half hour doing it, hour and a half, depends on the length of the story and the complexity of the story. But I often find that ultimately my story will be shorter actually when I'm done with the process because I'm tightening things up. Um, and in news reporting and in news writing, oftentimes you're writing about issues that are a little complex. And I think making those issues digestible to the reader, understanding the reader might not understand the issues in their entirety. You have to kind of give a bird's eye view of those issues. Again, you can get too wordy or too in the weeds, and you'll lose readers doing that. So I think just from my own standpoint, I find myself actually editing down my work and making it more concise and more digestible. And then I'll also say like repeating words, like you said, the word that was a crutch for you.
Mhm.
Having word variation, sentence variation, changing up sentence structures. Sometimes when I'm just sitting there hammering away on a computer, I get repetitive, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah.
So it mixes things up, I think. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It
Yeah.
does. Perfect. Are you working like fact checking and that into the self edit, or have you already done that at this point, or does that come later?
I actually find no, I try to get in front of that stuff the second I start writing, right? Like if I have a question about something, I try to nip it in the bud immediately, because I don't want to forget it,
Sure.
which can happen, right? Um, so if I stumble, even if it's the spelling of someone's name or the spelling of a business or whatever it may be, I try to check it then. But I will say during the self-editing process, and again, I think it's actually very valuable in this fine piece of machinery here.
Mhm.
Um, I actually always catch stuff, um, fact checking stuff. And many times it's names, it's the spelling of a name, or maybe I'll spell it differently one time. Um, businesses, streets, I
Right.
mean, kind of monotonous stuff, but stuff that, it's easy it's easy for the boat to pass you by, you know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Yeah,
But stuff that absolutely, serves to undermine some of the credibility if you get it wrong. So yeah.
exactly,
This
exactly.
this may be a little bit of a controversial question here. Let's see. We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but when you are we've talked a couple of presentations that I do. I talk about AI tools, and a lot of what we encourage folks to do with AI is not necessarily ask it to generate things from nothing, but to help you kind of reformat. Where if we're saying, let's take this article I've written, but give it to me in a 100-word um, teaser that I can put in an email newsletter or something like that.
That's very interesting.
Have you done very much, or your team done very much with AI to help that to make things more concise? To say, I know it's been tempting to me. I've got 500 words. Oh, I'm supposed to get that to 350. Can AI be a tool to do that, or we're not there yet?
It's definitely a brave new world. I can confidently say, for better or for worse, we haven't touched it in our newsroom. And there might be some areas where we could explore it for efficiency purposes. I think what you're saying is really interesting. And actually, I mean, not to veer totally off topic, but I actually just I recently made a new friend. That can still happen as you get older. And he's very well versed in the AI field, and he's actually a former journalist and still a writer. And he was talking about some of the things that AI could be beneficial, and some of the examples you gave I actually think are great. I think for some of our newsletters we certainly could explore it. um
Yeah.
Overall, as a newsroom, I don't think we've been resistant to it, but we have a young, informed staff. I think that our reporters are resistant to using it, truthfully, judging from the conversations I've had with them.
Yeah.
Um, I do think it's 2024, and I do think finding a way to explore using it for efficiency purposes that you're alluding to, honestly, to not explore it, that's called burying your head in the sand, and I don't think that's a smart move. So I think we could exploit it for certain areas, but we haven't dipped our toe in that water really at all here.
That's fine. No worries. And I didn't go over that at a time, so we may cut out that section in post. Um, when we're talking about editing, so you said that your job as a writer is not done until you turn in the copy. And I know that some of what you do, like you said, is writing, but a lot of what you do is editing. And I know back from remembering the times that I turned in what I thought was a masterpiece, and the editor didn't agree. And and that's hard. We joke about it. Being in the newspaper business, you got to have pretty thick skin to be able to take that. But it's hard for folks. Do you have working with young writers, new writers, with folks that don't have a ton of experience? Do you have any tips for them, or any lessons you've learned yourself to kind of help get over some of the feelings that come up sometimes when an editor does take a red pen to the copy that you've turned in?
It's an outstanding question. And, on one hand, you want people that are passionate about the words they're putting on paper.
True.
So you love that fire. But at the same token, you also need to know that, people are in their roles for a reason, and there is a hierarchy. And again, I mean, people are in their positions for a reason. I would say the biggest thing is this. Writing is an art form, right? I think journalism is an art form. Oftentimes we personalize our work. I do it too. We take a lot of pride in our work. I would just say the less personalization on that front, don't take it personal. Have the ability to let go, and also pick and choose your battles, because you're not going to win every one. But
and depending on the editor, you may not win any of them, just for the record.
Depending on the editor, you might not win any of them. But I do think, in any good working relationship, there's a give and a take. And, I mean, generally speaking, if somebody gives me 5 things, I'm probably not going to say yes to all of them. But if I see it that, 1 or 2 of them is particularly important to them, we're going to work to find a middle ground. So yeah, pick and choose your battles. Don't personalize it. And also understand the editor probably is in their role for a reason. They probably know what they're doing. And they're ultimately, we all want the same thing. We want the best piece of work out there for the community. I mean, that's simple as that.
What are some of the things that you do as an editor to help writers get more concise, or to help shorten stories? Is it cutting back on some of the exposition at the beginning where they're laying out background, or is it a word by word? What are some of the strategies or things that you look for when you're trying to help a writer make a more concise article or story?
Yeah, so I think here we have a very good editing process. I mean, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but we have a good system where they really see the edits in place, and we explain why we're doing them. It's actually, honestly, out of all the newspapers I've worked at, I think we have the strongest editing system here, believe it or not.
Okay.
I think, though, the most important thing in my job, and this is something I've just kind of come across, honestly, the last 6 months, but better to get in front of the story than behind it, and with the reporters, in fairness to them, it would be fairly upsetting to me if I handed in an 800-word story and the editor's like, this should be 500. That's a conversation that should be happening before the jump ball.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Don't tell me in the second quarter what you need. Tell me in pregame lineups what you need. I mean, I don't need to be making it. So I think that's been, again, we're all learning. And I think that's been a key lesson here, is kind of like, hey, look, like, good story idea, let's make it this and not this. Or, maybe it actually garners a 1,200-word story. And, even, kind of reciting, like, this is your lead, this is your strong intro, good nut graph here, this is what it should say. I just think being in front of the coaching, good coaches are in front of the ball, they're not behind it. I guess that's probably the biggest thing I've learned.
That's a really good way to think about it.
Yeah.
When you talk about communication, obviously you're speaking my language there. In that relationship, I remember I worked at a newspaper for over a year before, and I was covering like a region area where I had a lot of datelines. Our rule was like, if it's outside of the home county for the paper, we would have a dateline on there. And I was there for a year. I mean, a few hundred stories before an editor came up to me and said, hey, on the dateline, when you do 2 minus signs, every time you've done that, I have to go back and change it to a long dash or an M dash or N dash. And if you just do this, it doesn't do that, and I don't have to do that anymore. And thank you for telling me. And then I started thinking back. I mean, he had to change that a couple hundred times throughout the year before he came to tell me. So yeah, I think what you're saying there, that rings true, that that communication on the front end and even in the editing process. Sounds like y'all have a good level of transparency in there so folks can see the edits.
Yeah, we definitely do. Now, I mean, again, that doesn't mean we don't have hurdles or that, there aren't disagreements here and there, but
course.
there is very clear, I've worked at publications before where I've written stuff or someone else has for that matter, and I just changed it and I didn't communicate with them about it. Or I picked up a story before that I've written and I'm like, I didn't write the first 4 or 5 paragraphs. And I think that's a disservice to everybody involved, right? I mean, but this is what it needs to be. And oh, by the way, here's why. And hey, you know what? I'd rather have that than get blindsided. And again, kind of talking about the story, the expectations of the story before it's written as opposed to after it's written is always a good rule of thumb, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in an episode about being concise, we don't need to run too long here. But the last question I had for you, Teddy, was what advice do you have for somebody who's maybe they've listened to this and they've realized, those are some things that I need to do. I'm always struggling with keeping a story concise. What are some advice, some pieces of advice that you might have for them to get started to become a better writer by focusing on being concise?
Again, I mean, I don't know. I think a great tool personally. I love reading Associated Press work.
Okay.
They do very good. And again, we're talking here as it applies to my job, but I think it could apply to any form of writing.
Sure.
They have a very balanced approach to their reporting. They might lean 60-40 one way or the other, but I think that they walk a very fine line there. They cut it right down the middle. They do it in a very concise form. They also have some very good long form journalism. They do it by the book. And I think that's kind of how I learned my news writing style. And I would encourage any young reporter or just anyone picking up writing and trying to articulate issues, report issues in the community. I would point them right to their website or right to their app. And I would tell them, get to work, get informed about our society and figure out how they're passing out the message, because that's how I've done it. That's how I've done it.
Makes sense. You want to be a good painter, you study the greats. You want to be a good writer, you study the people out there doing a great job with the work. That makes perfect sense.
That's it.
Hey, Teddy, thank you so much for joining me.
No problem, Andy. Thanks for having me.
He is Teddy Feinberg, the managing editor at the Idaho Press and the writing instructor at the upcoming StoryConnect conference. Again, you can find information about the conference. We would love to have you join us. Information is at StoryConnect.com. It's going to be in Hood River, Oregon from April 8 to 10. And like I said, we would love to see our listeners of the podcast also join us there in Hood River. He's Teddy Feinberg. I'm Andy Johns, your host with Pioneer. Until we talk again, keep telling your story.
StoryConnect is produced by Pioneer Utility Resources, a communications cooperative that is built to share your story. StoryConnect is engineered by Lucas Smith of Lucky Sound Studio.